Welcome to the fifth of 5 videos from the Roman Army 2021 lecture of the UofW on enemies. In this fifth video, I'm going to talk a bit about the Huns. We're now dealing with the end of antiquity. I mean, Sasanians are too, but and it also, in some ways, represents a fourth kind of enemy besides Romans themselves, and kind of a reversal of what we see with the Celts and Gauls. So, at least with respect to Caesar. So, whereas the Gaul was conquered by Caesar and made into province of provinces, in this case, the Huns, tried to conquer Rome and had some success with this as well. And just as the Celts maybe had been some loosely associated people that could be brought together under a charismatic leader like Vercingetorix against Rome, in many respects, the Huns, or the Hunnic army that invaded Roman territory, was a heterogeneous mass of both Huns and other people who often would be independent, loosely connected, until they were under a more charismatic leader like Attila. This video also gives me a chance to talk about a small thing, well, a big thing that I haven't really said a lot about. And not only, of course, does Rome face all these different people, I've said a little bit about the difference between the different kinds of people they fought, but they're also, it goes both ways. So they might be successful, but often Rome's continued conflict and contact with other people leads to changes within Rome itself. So not just, they conquered Gaul and they had a new province and more people, but some of the weapons and technology that they use are picked up and adapted from these other people. And we've talked a bit about this when we talked about clothing and armor and equipment. So I'll just say a little bit more about that here. Okay, so the Huns. So we're into the age of migrations. Okay, and here's a map, one of the ones I use in other classes. The Barbarian Invasions, it's, there's a lot of arrows, there's a lot of named people, it gives you a sense of people moving back and forth. Of course, I'm from the school of thought that doesn't necessarily call it late antiquity. The 4th and the 5th centuries is entirely, into the 6th, entirely sort of invasions. There's a lot of migrations. Sometimes there are attacking war bands, sometimes there are people fleeing other people, so it's a whole host of things going on, and there's all sorts of internal problems at Rome as well, which I won't even get into. So who are the Huns? The Romans sometimes characterize them later as the scourge of God, sort of devil-like characteristics. There's some debate about their origins. The line that I'm taking follows some other scholarship, and I should, while I'm recording this, don't do that to me. Let's do this. I'm going to change this to BCE to 1st century CE. Okay. So possibly emerging or coming from the Altai Mountains, sort of central, heading towards East Asia, sort of beyond the Himalayas and towards Mongolia. There was a so-called Xiongnu Empire, which had been very active in China in the last few centuries BCE, and from the 3rd century BCE into the 1st century CE. I just want this. I'm sorry, I didn't know at the time. So this is a very crude generalization, but they came up against China in the, if you think about the terracotta army, all these terracotta soldiers found in sort of Han China, that's the approximate era. And to some degree, the Mulan story from Disney picks up on the Huns, the Xiongnu, that they faced at this time. And I should say the Great Wall of China, for that matter, also. The current state is a more recent one, but made in stages over many centuries and meant to keep out northern steppe peoples. So the Huns are seen to be people from the steppes. The steppes are basically like from here west to the Rockies, sort of prairie undulating stuff, fairly flat-ish, wide open, big skies. This is the Asian equivalent. Horses that were domesticated by humans are, really from around there. There's a lot of great research on that too. Some typical features of the Huns are also sort of, in many ways, typical of other steppe people. So there are things like mounted warfare on horseback, royal hunts, think of the Persians, some connection to this as well, falconry, shamanism, and certain kinds of clothing. Now, as far as the Romans are concerned, and, assuming this is the same or descended people, they first appear in Roman history in the 4th century CE, and Ammianus Marcellinus, who describes a whole series of invasions. Huns defeating Alans, Alans defeating Goths, and then the Goths defeat Romans, and they're all pushing against each other. So he describes them in remarkable detail. A lot of it is quite hokey, so it's not the best, but it's interesting nonetheless. And this is actually also to sort of bring all these videos to bring it back around to where we started. Just we talked about Roman views of barbarians, and various slightly variations depending on the people, and this dichotomy. The Huns start off when they first appear in Ammianus is quite negative, a bit like the Scythians and Herodotus, and fairly derogatory, etc. You move to the 5th century, age of Attila, and there's still some negative, obviously, because they're attacking Rome, but the Romans are also more familiar with them. So we get things like this account by an unfortunately fragmentary historian named Priscus, who writes in Greek, is Roman, who seems to have spent a lot of time visiting Attila at one of his camps. And, his account, based on what survives, is much more positive. And then you can move to the 6th century, and we find Huns fighting with Rome. And still some of that sort of stereotypical barbaric topoi negativity, but nothing like Ammianus Marcellinus. Okay, so Ammianus Marcellinus introduces them. By 387, they're in the Hungarian plain, so that's sort of Pannonias-ish. And by some accounts, they have a fairly hodgepodge empire. There's been debate over, are they mostly cavalry? Are they mixed? And I sort of take the more mixed line myself. Yes. Okay, and there's some other people who've written about their tactical superiority. Now the things really pick up in the 5th century, and this is when Ruga, predecessor to Attila, invades Thrace. Thrace is much of modern-day Bulgaria. Okay, and at this time, the Roman Empire has been divided in two. There's a western half of the Roman Empire, and there's an eastern sort of Roman Empire. The western half has shrunk. Eastern Empire is still actually quite prosperous, and the 6th century would be even more prosperous. And so quite successful, and they still have significant finances, resources, etc. And they have sent off an army to battle the Vandals, who have taken North Africa and end up sacking Rome in the middle of the 5th century. So they're otherwise occupied, and nevertheless, Ruga invades, and the East Romans pay them off. Ruga is followed by Attila. Attila, of course, is the famous ruler of the Huns. He's been in media in various capacities, like this night at I don't have it yet. Night at the Museum is coming up. But he has a number of successes, makes his way west, and ends up fighting the Romans in a battle of the Catalonian plains, or Chalon, which, depending how you look at it, is a Roman victory or a Hunnic victory, or maybe a fairly evenly matched affair. Thereafter, he maybe heads south in Chalon, Catalonian plains in France. After that, he heads south into Italy, is met by the Pope, persuades him not to head towards Rome, and then on his wedding night, and a night of possibly drunken debauchery, but we're not entirely sure, he dies prematurely, a bit like Alexander the Great, possibly killed by a lover, who knows. And his kingdom sort of falls apart thereafter. Now, looking beyond this into the impact of the Huns, so there is good evidence. So we talked in the previous video about the Persians, so this great sort of equal of Rome, two powers with similar issues. They fight against each other, and they also fight against other people. A shared enemy for them are the peoples of the steppes, okay, who impacted them both in certain ways. And one of the things I'd already said about the Huns, they, mounted warfare is one thing, and sort of a particular way of fighting where you're fighting on horseback, you're using archery, a lot of sort of like, riding away from someone and turning back and shooting them. Now, there are debates about how well organized their empire are. One person, Kim, says they're very well organized and huge impact. Other people have been more skeptical. Suffice to say, though, them and their predecessors did have an impact on how Rome fought and also how the Persians fought as well. They did have some remarkable weaponry, etc. Something the composite reflex bow, which later gets sort of adapted by the Romans. And under Attila, they did have a great deal of success and expanded quite quickly. Just a final point before I just say a couple things on more things about the Huns. So they're to say with the mounted archery and its impact. If you're interested to see how steppe people have impacted how Rome fought, but also how Persia fought, you should check out the Eurasian Way of War by Graf, written published 2016. So big things, not just that the Huns had, but their predecessors, Sarmatians, and other people had, are like the mounted archer that we see here, but also things like Clibanarii and Cataphracti. These are the heavily, if you don't know what this is, think of medieval knights jousting, etc. in movies where you have a fully armored horse and a fully armored knight on top of the horse, often with a long lance. Okay, these heavily armored cavalry gets used there and adopted by Rome to some degree, gradually over a period of a few centuries. Okay, so, and I probably should have said this earlier, sources with Huns, there's Night of the Museum, Attila. Hard to say what that is, but yeah. So Romans looked down on them earlier. Ammianus says they're a bit sketchy and they're nomads and they have dirty clothes and they make weird noises. And they don't farm, so they're not settled. They don't know about their families, all these things Romans don't like. But there's other evidence of different things. And I feel like I've actually already mentioned it, so this just goes back to some of my earlier points about them. One of the famous things they're known for, so-called, is the elongated skulls, which seems to have been a practice adopted otherwise. Anyway, okay, so I'm going to stop there. So there's a little bit on the Huns, okay, and different people with impact on Rome, and a bit on sources and their impact. And that's a lot of enemies. Keep it real.